Two men, opposite sides of Earth, 1858. Same idea simultaneously. Charles Darwin in England, 20 years into his secret theory. Alfred Russel Wallace in the Malay Archipelago, fever-ridden, scribbling the same mechanism in a hut. How does that happen? Was it coincidence? Theft? Divine timing? Why didn't anyone see it for 2,000 years, then suddenly two people see it within months of each other? We say great minds think alike, but that's just a saying. That's not an explanation. What does simultaneous discovery actually tell us about how truth reveals itself? The answer is stranger than genius, stranger than coincidence. The reason has nothing to do with brilliant minds. It's about what islands do. Here's the story everyone tells. Darwin spent 20 years developing his theory of evolution by natural selection. He was cautious, methodical, collecting evidence. Then, in June 1858, a letter arrives from Wallace, a young naturalist collecting specimens in the Malay Archipelago. The letter contains an essay outlining almost exactly Darwin's theory. Darwin panics. 20 years of work about to be scooped by someone he barely knows. His friends arrange a joint presentation to the Linnean Society. Both men get credit. Everyone says it's a remarkable case of parallel evolution of ideas, a coincidence of genius. But that's unsatisfying, isn't it? It doesn't explain anything. It just restates the puzzle in fancier words. Wrong question. How did Wallace steal Darwin's idea? He didn't. Wrong question. How did both men arrive at the same conclusion? Still not it. Real question. Why didn't anyone see this for 2,000 years, then suddenly two people see it within months? Something changed in the world, not in their heads, in what they could observe. Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands in 1835 aboard the Beagle. He noticed something peculiar. The mockingbirds on different islands were slightly different. The finches had different beaks, depending on which island they lived on. The giant tortoises had different shell shapes island to island. Wallace, 20 years later, observed the exact same pattern in the Malay Archipelago. Orangutans, butterflies, birds varying from island to island in the chain. Here's what islands are. Natural experiments. On the mainland, species blur together. Variations exist, but they're hidden in the noise of interbreeding, migration, mixing populations. But islands isolate populations. Geographic barriers prevent mixing, and suddenly variations become unmistakable. You can hold specimens side by side and ask, why is this island's mockingbird different from that island's mockingbird? You can't just say, God made them that way. There are too many variations. They're too similar to each other, too obviously related, but also too precisely matched to their specific islands. The pattern screams for a mechanism. One island with one unique bird? That's curious. 10 islands, each with its own variation of the same basic bird, each variation matched to that island's conditions? That's a pattern demanding explanation. Well, not just islands, archipelagos specifically. You need multiple islands close together to compare. One isolated island might show you something strange, but an archipelago forces you to see the pattern. But wait, archipelagos have existed for millions of years. Why did the 1830s through 1850s suddenly become so productive for this kind of observation? Two things changed. First, steamships. Before steam, reaching remote island chains like the Galapagos or the Malay Archipelago was extremely difficult. You had to rely on wind and currents. If you made it there at all, you couldn't stay long. You couldn't collect systematically. After steam power, naturalists could reach these places reliably, stay for months, collect thousands of specimens from multiple islands, document everything carefully. Second, specimen preservation improved dramatically. Better techniques for preserving skins, bones, plants meant you could bring vast collections back to England or Europe intact. Then you could lay them out in cabinets, compare them side by side, see patterns that would be invisible if you only had fragmentary reports and a handful of damaged specimens. Here's the thing. This isn't about genius, it's about access. Wallace wasn't smarter than Aristotle. He had better boats and better jars for preserving specimens. Technology changes what's thinkable. You can't discover the mechanism of species formation from island isolation if you can't reach islands or can't bring back comparable specimens. So what pattern did they both see? The variations aren't random decoration. They match the island's conditions precisely. A dry island with hard seeds produces finches with tough, thick beaks for cracking those seeds. A wet island with abundant insects produces finches with delicate, narrow beaks for catching insects. Trees on an island without large herbivores grow low to the ground. Same trees on an island with giant tortoises grow tall, out of reach. Why would separate creations match conditions so exactly? If each species was independently created for its island, why the family resemblance? Why do all Galapagos finches look related? It's too coincidental, unless the conditions themselves are selecting which birds survive. Birds vary naturally, every farmer knows this. You breed pigeons, cattle, dogs. You see variation in every generation. So island birds vary too. Now, the island conditions kill some variants, spare others. Birds with beaks too delicate for hard seeds starve on the dry island. Birds with beaks too thick for catching insects starve on the wet island. The survivors breed. They pass their traits to offspring. Repeat this for thousands of generations, and the population shifts. It accumulates traits that match the island. That's the mechanism. Differential survival of natural variation. Darwin called it natural selection. Wallace, in his letter, described the same process, though Herbert Spencer later coined survival of the fittest. Same mechanism, independently derived from the same type of evidence. Wait, where does the variation come from? Both men noticed the mechanism of selection. Neither knew the source of variation. Animals vary. Okay, but why? They didn't know. Couldn't know. Microscopes weren't good enough yet to see cells properly, let alone anything inside them. Darwin hypothesized something he called gemmules, particles from all body parts that somehow accumulated in reproductive organs. Wrong. Wallace thought maybe some unknown force generated variation. Vague, no mechanism. The actual answer, copying errors in hereditary material, DNA mutations during replication, that's 1950s knowledge. They had no way to see it. But here's the point. You can discover a mechanism without knowing the deeper cause. Natural selection works regardless of where variation comes from. As long as three conditions are met, variation exists, traits pass to offspring somehow, and some traits aid survival more than others, then selection must occur. It's mathematical inevitability. You don't need to understand genetics to see that populations will shift toward whatever traits help them survive and reproduce. Both men saw this inevitability. Once you see it, it's like looking at a boulder balanced on a hilltop. You know gravity will pull it down eventually. You don't need to understand quantum mechanics to predict the boulder will fall. Now here's what actually frightened people. It's not that Wallace almost stole Darwin's credit. Priority disputes happen in science constantly. That's just professional anxiety. The real terror is how obviously true it is once you see it. You can't unsee it. Every living thing becomes evidence. Your hand, shaped by selection for grasping. The pigeon in the park, shaped by selection for urban scavenging. The weed growing in a sidewalk crack, shaped by selection for disturbed ground. Everything shaped by differential survival. Darwin delayed publishing for 20 years, partly because he saw the implications immediately. If natural selection shaped finch beaks, it shaped everything, including humans. No special creation, no divine blueprint, no purpose handed down from above, just organisms surviving well enough to reproduce, generation after generation, accumulating whatever traits help them not die before breeding. Let me prove it to you. Look at artificial selection, what farmers do. They select cattle for milk production, meat, wool. They get dramatic changes in just a few generations. Look at dog breeds, wolves to pugs, wolves to chihuahuas, wolves to Great Danes, all in roughly 15,000 years of human-directed breeding. Same mechanism, just human-directed instead of nature-directed. If we can reshape species that dramatically in thousands of years with conscious selection, what can nature do with millions of years and unconscious selection? Nature has time. Nature can reshape anything into anything, given sufficient time and selection pressure. The troubling implication, We're not designed. We're edited drafts, survival tested. All those perfect design arguments, the complexity of the eye, the intricacy of the hand, those aren't evidence of planning. They're accumulations of incremental improvements. Each generation slightly better than the last at not dying before reproducing. Nothing guided, nothing intended, just what worked, preserved. So why did it take two people to discover this? Why couldn't Darwin trust himself after 20 years? The idea is too big for one mind to trust itself with. Darwin sat on it for decades, kept finding more evidence, kept testing it against every objection he could imagine. He needed overwhelming proof before publishing because he knew what he was saying. Everything you believe about human origins is wrong. Then Wallace's letter arrives. It confirms he's not crazy. He's not seeing patterns that aren't there. Another observer, different archipelago, same conclusion. That's when Darwin knew it was really true. Not because he was right. He'd been right for 20 years. Because nature was shouting it loud enough for two people in different parts of the world to hear it. Simultaneous discovery happens when several conditions align. Technology enables new observations. Those observations create a pattern too obvious to miss once you see it. The pattern has a mechanistic explanation. The mechanism is simple enough to grasp with existing concepts. Once those conditions are met, multiple independent observers become inevitable. This has happened before. Calculus. Newton and Leibniz discovered it simultaneously in the 1670s. Oxygen. Joseph Priestley and Carl Scheele discovered it independently in the 1770s. Natural selection. Darwin and Wallace, 1858. Not theft, not coincidence. Readiness. The idea was ready to be discovered. Circle back. I said it's about what islands do. Islands are isolation chambers. They split populations, prevent mixing, force local adaptation. On mainlands, gene flow smooths variations out, blurs the boundaries between populations. On islands, there's no gene flow. Variations accumulate. Boundaries sharpen. Each island becomes a separate experiment in survival. Same starting species, different environmental conditions. Wait thousands of generations. Get different results. The Galapagos finches started as one colonizing species that arrived from the South American mainland. Now there are 13 distinct species, each matched to its island's conditions. That's speciation observed. Well, inferred from the pattern of variations. Wallace saw the same thing in the Malay Archipelago. He even drew what we now call the Wallace Line, a boundary in the ocean where fauna types divide sharply. Australian-type animals on one side, Asian-type animals on the other side. Why? Deep water channel between them. Even during ice ages when sea levels dropped, that channel remained. Millions of years of separate evolution. The water barrier prevented crossing. Each side became its own evolutionary experiment. Geographic barriers are speciation engines. This is why both men needed archipelagos to see the mechanism. Single location observations don't reveal it. You need comparative data. Same species subjected to different conditions producing different outcomes. Then the mechanism becomes visible. The conditions are selecting. The populations are adapting. The species are diverging. Now, if islands force new species to form through isolation, what are continents but large islands? What is Earth itself but an isolated island in space? Life here evolved independently of anywhere else. If there's life elsewhere in the universe, it experienced different starting conditions, different selection pressures. It should produce completely different forms. Unless, and here's where it gets interesting, selection converges on similar solutions. Eyes evolved independently roughly 40 times on Earth. Insects, mollusks, vertebrates, all invented eyes separately. Flight evolved independently 4 times. Insects, pterosaurs, birds, bats. Similar problems produce similar solutions even with different starting materials. This suggests selection isn't a random walk through possibility space. It's a constrained walk. Some solutions work better than others. Selection finds them repeatedly, even starting from different directions. One might think Wallace would have embraced this fully, but late in his life, Wallace rejected human evolution by natural selection. He thought the human mind required divine intervention, that selection couldn't explain consciousness, art, mathematics. Darwin disagreed but stayed quiet publicly. He didn't want the fight. Ironic, isn't it? Wallace helped discover a universal mechanism, then exempted humans from it. I know, sounds weird. Why discover a principle that applies to everything, then add an exception? Because the implications are frightening. Easier to say, evolution for animals, but special creation for us. Gives us back our special status, our purpose, our meaning. But the evidence doesn't permit that comfort. Selection shaped our minds the same way it shaped finch beaks, by what survived to reproduce, back to 1858. 2 men, 2 letters, same idea. Now we see why. Islands made variation visible by isolating populations. Technology made islands accessible through steamships and preservation techniques. The pattern made a mechanism inevitable, too obvious to miss once you could compare specimens. The mechanism was simple enough to grasp with existing concepts. Survival, inheritance, variation. The timing was ripe. If not Darwin and Wallace, it would have been someone else soon after. Ideas have ecologies too. They need the right conditions to emerge and spread. Darwin's 20-year delay was him waiting for proof to pile up, for objections to be answered. Wallace's letter was a catalyst, not a threat. The joint publication credited both men properly. That's how it should work. And then what happened? The theory spread rapidly. Within a decade, it had reshaped biology completely. Not because Darwin or Wallace were persuasive writers, though Darwin's book was carefully argued, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The evidence is everywhere. Every organism is a case study in selection. Every fossil is a snapshot of evolutionary transition. The pattern is too obvious to deny once you're looking for it. Even those who tried to deny it kept finding more evidence for it. Selection explains too much. It connects too many observations. It makes testable predictions that keep proving true. So, did Wallace almost steal evolution from Darwin? Wrong framing entirely. You can't steal what nature is broadcasting. Both men tuned to the same frequency. The question isn't who thought of it first. That's just professional ego. The question is, why did nature finally reveal it then, after being invisible for millennia? Answer, we built the right tools, ships, jars, comparison methods. We looked at the right places, archipelagos that isolate and vary. We saw what was always there, selection operating on variation, generation after generation, shaping life into forms that survive. Selection operates whether we notice it or not. It operated for billions of years before we existed. It operated while we evolved. It's still operating now. We just finally noticed it in the 1850s, because we could finally see the pattern clearly enough to demand explanation. Next question. If selection shaped all past life, what's it still shaping? Are we still evolving? Yes, slowly, but yes. Can we direct our own evolution now that we understand it? Carefully, perhaps. What else is evolving around us right now, right this moment? Bacteria developing antibiotic resistance, viruses adapting to hosts, insects evolving resistance to pesticides. Selection never stops. The process that made us is still running, all around us, invisible unless you know to look for it. That's a different story, though. I've got to stop somewhere. But think about it. The mechanism that shaped every living thing you've ever seen, it's still going, still testing, still selecting, still shaping what comes next.